Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with the hilariously dysfunctional realm of the pantheon of ancient Greek gods. Strong, dramatic, and emotionally erratic. So before you settle in, if you truly love what I do here, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. What time is it for you, and where are you tuning in? It's always interesting to see who is joining us. Dim the lights now, and perhaps turn on a fan, all throughout the world. Let's start with the big guy himself and ease into tonight's voyage together for that gentle background hum. Olympus's ruler and the embodiment of absolute authority is Zeus, the god of the sky. Zeus, the youngest son of Cronus, and Zeus completely destroys your sense of boundaries. Like many wonderful fathers, Rhea's father had a tendency to devour his kids alive, to keep him from being overthrown romantically. Thankfully, Rhea saved infant Zeus by using a pebble under a blanket to fool Cronus, demonstrates how attentive this man was. After Zeus matured, Freud would have a field day and released him after he led a divine uprising against Cronus and cut open his father's tummy. Poseidon Hades, Hestia, and Data Boom, his siblings, were the original following the victory of the gods over the Titans. Zeus, a dysfunctional family, emerged, became king, dominated the sky, had power over lightning and thunder, and was in theory, Zeus is in charge of cosmic order, justice, and oaths. In actuality, spent the majority of his time changing into different creatures and wooing anything that had a heartbeat, including bulls, eagles, golden mist. The man lacked composure and a steady moral compass. Picture it's Zeus, but with more lightning, when the nation's Supreme Court justice turns into a goose to flirt with civilians. His marriage to his sister Hea went about as smoothly as you might have imagined, but his love life was an open-source catastrophe. Hundreds of relationships with mortals, deities, nymphs, and most likely one or two houses a large number of demigod children as a result of plants, many of whom had severe problems with parental abandonment and unintentionally created whole mythologies. Zeus wasn't completely chaotic, though, when he wasn't lying or throwing lightning at people, who served as the cosmic referee but failed to make appropriate sacrifices, upheld the law, enforced oaths, and occasionally disciplined those who were more conceited than he was, which, to be honest, Zeus was revered, feared, and continuously making Olympus's public relations nightmares. He had a commanding presence and no comprehension of personal space. He was the ultimate heavenly contradiction, a predator, a judge, and a joke. Ironically, Hea is considered the goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth, despite the fact that her own marriage isn't Zeus's wife, and his chariot is a whole skip fire in a golden chariot. Sister, as you are aware, their wedding was meant to be it became a centuries-long soap drama, instead of the heavenly ideal of sacred unity. Full of retaliation for infidelity, and a startling amount of people who were transformed into stones, trees, or animals. As the undeniable queen of the gods, Hera is strong, although her strength mostly manifests. Vengeance is one way that it expresses itself. Naturally, it would be too easy. Here's fury is laser-focused. On the women Zeus woos or, let's face it, abducts, and their poor offspring. She once became a one woman turned into a cow, cursed another to talk only in echoes, and once attempted to murder infant Hercules, with two snakes that were actually his baby, hers, not his. No, it's difficult to hold her solely responsible. Picture yourself as the marriage goddess. Even if your husband is creating new animal-based seduction techniques, she frequently uses divine coping tactics, comprised complex punishments and eternal curses. Therapy was non-existent in ancient Greece. Retaliation was therefore the next best course of action. Yet despite everything, Hia wasn't merely a heavenly resentment. She also safeguarded women during childbirth and maintained the theoretical sacredness of marriage and penalized mortals for breaking their oaths. She had temples, priests, and a cult-following population in places like Samos and Argos Ha. The goddess you prayed to was revered as a powerful force of divine order. When your husband was faithful, and when he wasn't, it was most likely you who sent the plague. She is an intriguing paradox that embodies the strength and dignity of women. Her narrative goes beyond jealousy in a system that continuously humiliated her. Concerning a woman who was meant to represent harmony while preserving Olympus by blatant animosity and ornamentation, Poseidon was the sea deity of earthquakes, storms, and fury. However, for some reason, horses, as nothing more embodies the ocean deity than a herd of stallions charging through the air. However, according to mythology, he was one of the three principal brothers who received the sky from Zeus. Poseidon got everything wet, which was ideal for him, and Hades got the underworld. He controlled both beautiful and terrifying marine creatures, presided over the enormous waters, and wielded a huge trident, is a three-pronged divine rage stick that can do more than simply a sharp fork. Poseidon was both feared and admired for his ability to level large towns. Measure fishermen offered sacrifices, and sailors prayed to him for safe travel. Before placing anything too near the shore, city builders sought his approval to avoid making it beachfront. Property by mistake. But let's face it, Poseidon had problems. Large, tidal wave-sized emotional problems. He was the quintessential unpredictable uncle, is always a little salty, sometimes giving and other times damaging. He builds islands one minute, then floods your fields because someone neglected to give him credit at a sacrifice. Goat ritual. Once, after losing a goat, he beat the ground with his trident so forcefully that it sparked an earthquake. Sincerely, she presented Athens with an olive tree, and he promised to name the city after her. He chose vengeance, while the others chose olives in a salty spring. In summary, Poseidon also had a convoluted romantic life. There were, in one instance, Medusa was branded a monster and given snake hair because of nymphs and mortals, and him leaving without repercussions. Classic. Despite all of that, Poseidon was more than simply a violent storm god. He was a city builder, a defender of sailors, and in his calmer times, a fertility and prosperity deity who was vital to ancient Greek society, particularly for a society that is so reliant on the sea. Yet he was. Hades was always just one storm away from reminding everyone who was in command. Is the deity of the underworld a huge, dark place that is not quite hell? In contrast to contemporary pop culture, all souls eventually clock out for eternity. Hades wasn't exceptionally nasty or evil. He was just extremely weary of everyone. Zeus took the skies, Poseidon. When Hades drew the short straw, he was forced to deal with the ancient Greek. The dead's idea of customer service for eternity in the dark, surrounded by Hades, dominated the underworld with a silent, menacing power. Although he wasn't loud, he wasn't flamboyant, he didn't interrupt weddings or throw lightning, he just showed up for work each day to oversee eternity's logistics and ensure that souls didn't slink out the back. Final Middle Manager Hades was also the name of his website, since reportedly it featured parts for the heroic Elysium and the common asphodel. Thus, naming a kingdom after oneself wasn't a warning sign back then. And guess who had to supervise the dreadful Tartarus, ancient Greece's equivalent of a protracted detention? That's correct. Hades the Goth is the god's workaholic. Now, let's talk about Persephone. It's true that he abducted her. It's terrible, undoubtedly troublesome, but furthermore, and Greek mythology is nothing if not contradictory. In fact, they developed into a strangely stable and efficient marriage. Spent half the year on Earth generating spring, and the other half with him providing life to the underworld. Hades, the original pet father, shared more legendary time with romance. Cerberus, the dog, lacked obedience training and had a three-headed rage. However, he generally kept souls in line. In contrast to his siblings, Hades didn't cheat, anger, and didn't want attention, which is likely why the ancient Greeks didn't frequently construct temples for him. He was the quiet, gloomy uncle you didn't ask to the party but yet respected, and you were afraid of drawing his attention. From a respectful and safe distance, Athena is the goddess of war and wisdom. She's essentially the divine at strategy, handicrafts, and staying 10 steps ahead of everyone without getting sweaty. Representation of reason in a world full of lightning bolt-wielding emotional wrecks. Her birth alone is enough to give Freud Zeus has nightmares after ingesting her pregnant mother Modus due to prophecy. Naturally, he experienced a severe headache. Instead of taking aspirin, he used a hammer to the skull, and Athena emerged, fully developed, fully armored, and completely dissatisfied with everyone. Athena made it apparent right away that in contrast to her war-loving brother, she was not here for foolishness. Ares Athena saw confrontation as a chessboard that could be managed, analyzed, and won with little yelling, and optimal effectiveness. Athena was a war room, whereas Ares was a tumultuous pub battle. Although it may sound strange, she is also the goddess of crafts in addition to spreadsheets. Just ask Arachne, a mortal who ventured to weave, till you realize it was a battleground. Arachne challenged Athena to a weaving competition, which she technically won, but was later transformed into a spider for having a bit too much talent. The story's moral: embrace your new existence in the corner of someone's ceiling, or remain modest. Athena avoided romance completely, in contrast to the rest of Olympus. Entice people to marry her brother, or change into dubious animals. Only have tasks to complete, like as protecting heroes in cities and advising owls on how to raise. She led Odysseus home, assisted Perseus in decapitating Medusa, and most likely edited the Athena is the goddess you would want on your debating team in your war council, or Iliad with a red pen. Managing your startup, she outsmarts you without screaming or plotting. The Greek deity of war, slaughter, and punching first, never if, was always Ares. Eris was at battle with a sledgehammer and a weak will, while Athena was at war with a blueprint. Control. He stood for the ruthless, unadulterated anarchy of combat, the moment when yelling men slammed into one another, and nobody really understood what was going on, other than that something was burning, and someone simply misplaced a helmet. To put it briefly, if Ares appears, things are getting noisy, angry, and incredibly disorganized in terms of personality. Even his fellow gods didn't much like him. Zeus once referred to him as the most. When Zeus calls you a problem, you know you've messed up. Ares was conceited, hateful of all the gods. The Greeks admired him, but he was not much regarded since he was hot-headed and as subtle as a burning chariot. Strategy, self-control, and cunning that Eris has continuously failed to bring to the he didn't use strategies to win wars. Instead, he just charged in, and that worked. Occasionally, but more frequently, it left a path of corpses, and grave Eris was still terrible. He was the god of dread, according to irritated allies. He genuinely adored his boys, Phobos and Deimos, also known as Panic and Terror. He had an affair with Aphrodite when he was involved in a fight, which seems romantic until you think about it, concluded with her husband Histus entangling him in an invisible web and the entire pantheon laughing at him. Roman mythology gave Ares a makeover, which delighted the ancient Greek newspapers. Mars was more honorable, disciplined, and less perspiring, but he remained the turbulent, violent, muscle-bound persona. Ari nevertheless had his moments. Warriors offered sacrifices to him in the real conflict because they feared and revered him. He would give them strength, or, at the very least, ignore them for a while. He also rode he receives at least one style point for his stylish chariot drawn by fire-breathing horses. The goddess of love, beauty, desire, and amorous entanglements, Aphrodite incredibly high body counts. If you've ever witnessed someone fall in love with the wrong person far too quickly, congratulations. You have seen the divine power of Aphrodite. She has two Genesis myths. She is the daughter of Zeus and Dion in one form, depending on how much pain you can handle. In the elder and, to be honest, a far more bizarre version, she was created from the sea foam that was created when Cronus severed Uranus's equipment and threw it into the sea. Indeed, that is most likely the least romantic explanation for the Aphrodite. The goddess of passion was so exquisitely beautiful that mortals and in her presence, gods alike essentially lost the capacity to make wise choices. The cestus, her true magical belt, made her appealing to everyone, which is, let's face it, a little unfair advantage when it comes to love, even if they are the epitome of want. Aphrodite was married to Heristus, but her personal life was troubled. She notably favored the company of Ari, the god of war, despite being the diligent god of fire and blacksmithing. Everything you need to know about her preferences for guys Heristus caught them in the middle of their romance, exposing their affair. In a net of riches and called upon the other gods to visit ancient Greece, where group humiliation and retaliation were regarded as superior dispute resolution techniques. But Aphrodite had a gentler side as well. She wasn't only turmoil and infidelity. She offered beauty to the world, assisted young loves, and officiated marriages. Before declaring a crush or attempting to charm their way out of a foolish situation, folks would pray to her. She was not beyond inciting conflict, though, as she was the one who proposed Helen of Troy to Paris, which led to the Trojan War. Yes, a whole civilization was destroyed because she was trying to win a contest for divine beauty. Since Aphrodite desired a golden apple that declared to the most beautiful person, she's the patroness of want rather than stability. Gorgeous, seductive, and completely. The deity of fire, Heristus, was unconcerned with the limitations of your bond. Being the only Olympian with a job and having good metalwork. As the other gods were occupied with launching battles, hunting down mankind, or hurling lightning like confetti, Histus was murmuring under his breath while forging weapons in the workshop, constructing palaces, and his Genesis myth differs, but none. In one version, he is born with a deformity, and Hahi is thrown off Mount Olympus like unwanted luggage because of how repulsive he looks. In another, Zeus throws the man after a family quarrel. In either case, he falls. From heaven lands hard, leaving them with a permanent limp and likely some significant issues related to abandonment. Despite the difficult beginning, Jesus returns to Olympus, not by forgiving. He creates a magical golden throne for Haia using leverage, surprising and trapping her. The gods ask. He consents to go back and release her, but only if they allow him to rejoin the celestial club. The negotiation was flawless. Histus returns to Olympus and transforms into the divine handyman, creating Zeus's thunderbolts, Achilles' armor, Poseidon's trident, and almost any other miraculous object that someone boasts about, whether it glows or Hystas most likely made it while working for free for a long time. But for everyone. Despite his genius, he was always treated with contempt. His wife, Aphrodite, assigned not selected, infamously cheated on him with Ares, and his family did not feel close to. To put it politely, his co-workers are always breaking the things he just fixed. Hista's retaliation was inventive, graceful, passive-aggressive, and never snarled like Ares or plotted like Hia. Artisan made the net he used to capture Aphrodite and Ares mid-affair. Thoughtful and poetic, he isn't glamorous and was created for maximum public humiliation. He is the god who literally constructed Olympus, but he doesn't dazzle. The god's working-class deity and unsung hero is Histus, patron of innovators, blacksmiths, craftspeople, and anybody who has ever yelled at a Hermes, the deity of travelers' commerce, mended the broken machine using duct tape and fury. Thieves communicating and talking too quickly, he's the staff member with the winged sandals. That most likely came with Emmanuel's useless energy and the yell, "I've already lied twice and eaten 3 olives." Today. In contrast to other gods, Hermes truly took off. He emerged from his crib on the day of his birth, stole Apollo's cattle, and used a tortoise shell to create the lyre. And then, before anyone saw, went back to his cradle. That was day 1. Hermes needed roughly 6 hours to create that much chaos when other gods took decades. As the god's messenger, but that's understating it. He delivered more than simply messages. He smuggled souls into the underworld, led heroes through hostile area, and most likely created the divine equivalent of expedited shipment. Hermes was 2 steps ahead of the trouble, leaving behind a charming disguise and a dubious alibi. Additionally, he was the god of trade and business, since nothing says reliable marketplace energy. Similar to the person in charge of stealing Hermes symbolized persuasive negotiating and ethically adaptable business. In essence, the patroness of travelers, salespeople, pickpockets, and everybody else who's ever sold goods at a flea market. But Hermes wasn't just a lovely outlaw. Devoted when it mattered, he assisted Odysseus in defeating Circe. He provided Perseus with the instruments to decapitate Medusa. He even led spirits to the underworld with unexpected tenderness, demonstrating that he had a job he took seriously, despite all of that mayhem. The caduceus, a winged staff with 2 wings, was another of Hermes's trademark accessories. Ironically, entwined snakes are frequently mistaken for the sign of healing, given Hermes's main professional border hopping and quick lying were prerequisites for Olympus. Hermes, the overly enthusiastic tech man who uses acronyms to solve your problems, would be in charge of the IT department. Minutes before vanishing to optimize cloud services, which could or might not include taking Zeus's wallet because he is shrewd, fast, untrustworthy, and profoundly adorable. The god of completing tasks without consequence and without responding follow-up queries. Deita is the goddess of agriculture, grain harvesting, and bringing life to the planet as long as she's feeling it. When Deita is content, crops. When she's upset, the world blossoms with abundance and flourished trees bear fruit. Well, welcome to the winter hunger and overall demise. She's one of the more reserved Olympians who doesn't initiate wars or throw thunderbolts, doesn't make humans into animals. But don't assume that silence means she's harmless. Cut off the planet's food supply in a single, ill-tempered moment, which she actually did. Enter Persephone, her cherished daughter. One day, Persephone, the literal flower child of Olympus, goes flower picking. When the earth opens up and the god of Hades appears, she is going about her own legendary business. Her classic Greek parenting issue, Dea, gets kidnapped by a professional and criminal kidnapper. Naturally, she loses her celestial intellect and grieves, searching the earth but refusing to. Crops fail, animals suffer, and she lets everything grow until her daughter returns. Mortals plead for forgiveness. Demet replies, "No produce, no Pesfanani." Zeus eventually steps in, primarily because no sacrifices are being offered and people are dying. The seasons begin when a pact is made for Persephone to spend a portion of the year with Hades and a portion with Dieta. Dieta is joyful in the spring and summer, but she pouts in the autumn and winter. Dieta's periodic mood swings are the source of the most significant natural cycles in human existence. Global agriculture fueled via emotional blackmail and mother sadness. Mythology at its best, Dieta has a strong sense of justice as well. She once instructed people on how to cultivate wheat and establish civilizations. Then, after the parents halted her mid-ritual, she turned around and burned a royal infant. There's a thin border between Dieta is a goddess of life and a fearsome earth witch. However, her essence is foster resiliency and the sacrosanct mother-child link. She gives life. Dionysus, the god of wine, lifts it from the earth and removes it with equal ease. Actual fertility theater insanity and those dubious choices you make after drinking 3 glasses of whatever he's the divine representation of YOLO, clad in ivy and a little tipsy. And perhaps calling forth a panther Dionysus was born in extremely dramatic circumstances. Began as the offspring of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman. When Hera discovered, which she naturally did, she deceived Semele into requesting that Zeus show his really divine appearance. Zeus ever, the problem fixer, stitched the unborn after it vaporized her. Yes, he was carried to term by Dionysus into his thigh. In Greek mythology, Dionysus grew up exploring the world, and nothing is strange enough to be questioned. He was spreading wine, pretending to be happy, and a little existentially dreadful. A boisterous group of satyrs, maenads, and woodland party members, then crash a Dionion's devotion, was more than just having fun and eating grapes. It was a traveling circus of euphoria and maybe property damage. Rituals included shedding your identity, inhibitions, and occasionally your clothing. His celebrations were crazy, intense, frequently including mask theater and highly dubious choices. Imagine Burning Man under the skies, but with heavenly repercussions. However, Dionysus wasn't all fun and happiness. He was also a very theatrical person with a temper. One, if you made fun of him, disregarded his devotion, or disturbed his flow, became strange. His own people drove a king insane and mutilated him after he outlawed his cult. Another was transformed into a dolphin. He administered severe penalties rather than mild ones, although he was also incredibly sympathetic, particularly to misfits, outcasts, and people outside of civilized society. He provided consolation to the broken voice, to the voiceless, and sometimes turned individuals into vines, which is most likely a metaphor for the contradiction of divine emancipation and chaos is something that Dionysus is. His delight and devastation, art and lunacy. The deity who bestows upon you a moment of creation that makes you reconsider your life decisions the next time you're dancing barefoot in a vineyard. Artemis is the moon goddess and the goddess of hunting, wilderness, and wild animals. No, I won't explain myself, and sure, it was a threat. She is also the goddess of one of the rare Olympians who didn't have a bow in one hand and zero tolerance in the other as Artemis, need love potions or thunderbolts. She was disciplined, precise, and possessed a pack of Apollo-Artemis twin sister, the divine wolf, came into the world as a normal overachiever. Fashion. Shortly after her own birth, she assisted in the delivery of her own brother from that point on, she stopped dating men, vowed to never get married, and anything even approaching emotional sensitivity. Instead, she hunted stags and wandered through forests, and surrounded herself with a devoted group of young admirers who all appreciated the outdoors and didn't care for drama. The most famous thing about Artemis is her innocence, not in a fainting couch Victorian sense, but if you touch me more, I'll convert you into a deer. Consider a hunter who happened to stumble across her taking a bath. Instead of gently explaining limits, she turned him into a stag and allowed his own hounds to rip him to pieces. She was quite protective, especially of women and children, according to the message received. Mortals were considered by the Olympian gods like chess pieces or dating apps, and Artemis served as a she punished people who disregarded sacred nature or injured the defenseless, and she served as a divine protector for the weak. Vengeance was fast, lyrical, and typically lethal. She was a moon goddess, calmness, mystery, and clarity. She illuminated the night and led passengers through the dark, both literally and figuratively. If Apollo was the moon's intense, icy gaze, Artemis was the sun's dazzling radiance, less warmth, more vigilance. Artemis was not ostentatious, but she didn't have to be. You didn't. Rather of confronting her, you simply hoped she wasn't aiming at you. In contemporary terms, Artemis is the original self-reliant lady, fiercely independent, and completely unconcerned with what you consider her. Apollo is the god. She fled in the woods and did not reside on Olympus. Of the sun, music, healing, poetry, archery, and, to be honest, just assume that he listed his name on all of Mount Olympus's job openings. If the gods had connected Apollo's profile, it would have crashed. Artemis Apollo's twin brother is the gleaming, brilliant poster child of "We have daylight because of Olympus, the golden chariot, golden hair, and golden lyre." He really pushed the sun across the sky every day in a fiery chariot, according to Greek tradition. There's no pressure if you're running late, but there's a lot more to that genius than Apollo's emotive and dramatic nature makes him the person who sings ballads following a breakup, and then slurs the one who turned him down. Ask Daphne. She Apollo lamented her loss, and then transformed her into a tree in order to escape him. Transformed into a holy emblem, and wore her leaves as a crown as it's good for him. Additionally, he is the god of prophecy, which implies that even if he is technically aware that awful things will happen, he still becomes angry when they do. The quintessential overachiever, he founded the Oracle of Delhi, whose priestesses were driven by divine craziness. Very user-friendly, murmured poetic riddles that somehow explained everyone's fate. Apollo's connection with love was complicated. He pursued multiple mortals. Most people rejected it, and they responded with varied degrees of poetic exaggeration when during a discus match, a Spartan prince named Hyacinus passed away, probably as a result of Apollo's own misthrown disc. In spite of everything, he was so upset that he transformed the boy into a flower, which is lovely if you overlook the blunt force damage. Asclepius, the son of Apollo, became the deity of medicine. Apollo was also a healer. Furthermore, depending on how upset he was, Apollo himself could either cause or heal plagues. Felt that day, Apollo was, in essence, genius encased in power and insecurity. A short-tempered, poetic, and charming god who would write you a Hestia is the goddess of the home and hearth, and if you didn't clap, she would shoot you with an arrow after singing a love song. Peace, which is Greek for the lone Olympian, who didn't start a global conflict every week. She was Cronus and Rhea's eldest child, and the first to be completely absorbed by her endearingly suspicious father. Technically, she is the oldest, since she was the last to be thrown back up when Zeus overthrew him. Yes, Greek mythology is a funhouse mirror, and the youngest Olympian Hestia chose tranquilly, in contrast to her more erratic siblings. Engage in power struggles, refrain from using curses, and avoid having sex with mortals. And shrugged when offered a throne on Olympus without even making fun of it, courteously, and handed it to Dionysus Y, allowing her to care for the unquenchable flame and avoid becoming embroiled in family drama queen behavior. She oversaw whenever there was a flame, the hearth is the focal point of every house, temple, and city. Hestia was present in spirit with no temples in her, burning food or ritual to stay warm, just a silent presence that made everything else operate without any salacious myths. According to the original background, she was also the goddess of hospitality. She symbolized the holy responsibility of taking care of guests in a society when food and shelter meant survival. Calling upon her meant your bread wouldn't burn, your fire would remain lit, and perhaps your family would depart on schedule. In contrast to, she didn't go around transforming people into animals or inanimate objects or giving sarcastic moral teachings like most Olympians did. Hestia had inner peace and a clean floor, so she didn't need retribution. Every city had her flame, and every meal started and finished with an offering, burning in its heart, and there was certainly someone muttering during each prayer circle, "If the gods were an office with dysfunction, thank you for not being a handful." Dionysus, the HR infraction, Athena, the overqualified strategist, and Zeus, the CEO with boundary difficulties. Hestia would be the cool boss who kept the lights on and the coffee warm while everyone else quarreled about. Hestia, whose temple caught fire, serves as a reminder that the importance of silence can have great force. The one who holds everything but doesn't demand attention is perhaps the most important character in simplicity. Collectively, Persephone is among the most intriguing characters in Greek mythology. Deity who has two distinct personalities that are reflected in the seasons, the warmth of death and the bloom of spring, iron throne and flower crown, life and decay. She is the daughter of the harvest goddess Dita, who is already associated with fertility and life. But then things took a turn, as is customary in Greek mythology, when Hades, the underworld's ruler, saw her plucking flowers, led him to conclude that she was wife material. He then kidnapped her into the underworld. Data was naturally devastated when there was no conversation or coffee at first. Searched the land, and when no one could tell her where Persephone had disappeared, she completely stopped farming. Worldwide starvation and a vengeful horde of ravenous humans, Zeus finally stepped in not out of paternal care, but a compromise was made since nobody was starving and nothing was being sacrificed. If Persephone hadn't eaten anything in the underworld, of course, she had 6 pomegranate seeds, she could go back. She started her dual position half the year ago when she was legally bound to a part-time job in the land of the dead. On Earth, where Hades in the underworld brings us autumn and winter, while Data brings us spring and summer. Seasonal depression was created by the ancient Greeks using a myth, but things get fascinating with time. Rather than being a dejected, kidnapped flower girl, Persephone accepted her duty as queen of the dead and became a peaceful, firm monarch. And silently, strong mortals begged her for forgiveness so they may travel safely. Recognizing the equilibrium between life and death, she stands for change. The transition from innocence to strength is not only seasonal, but also emotional. Persephone is the goddess of duality who transforms from being taken to taking charge. She is the reason why flowers blossom and why they wilt before she passes through flowers and bones with equal ease. By the time Psyche became a lady, she was even old enough to comprehend the term divine to which she was being likened. While mortals traveled great distances to see the face of this mortal girl, sculptures of Aphrodite were collecting dust. Beauty wasn't just appreciated, it was revered. Whole audiences regarded her as people murmured that if she were Aphrodite resurrected in human form, it must be divine for a mortal woman to appear this way by chance. But for all the respect felt hollow to Psyche as she traversed towns and cities like a beloved, unexplored, and alone phantasm that no one dared to men approached her with genuine affection, viewing her as a living picture that was immaculate, silent, and untouchable. Despite their pride, even her relatives became worried because her two sisters had married aristocratic men, started families, and led the warm, anchored life that Psyche herself desired, but no suitor dared approach her, a girl who was thought to be Aphrodite's competitor, and there was danger for you. As you can see, the gods disliked rivalry, especially Aphrodite. The goddess became enraged as she saw her temples go silent as mortals placed garlands at a simple girl's feet. To her Psyche, divine wrath wasn't a lovely child. Rather, she was a chiseled insult. Becoming flesh, but Psyche was unaware of this and spent her days alone herself, strolling around gardens. Speaking to no one, she had never heard a vow spoken in the dark or felt the touch of a lover. Beauty had turned into a burden that separated her from the one thing she really desired, a soul that didn't see her, only her face. She would watch the horizon fade and think while standing by her window at dusk. Maybe it was her destiny to be adored by everyone, but rejected by everyone, not even by a priest or an oracle. Nobody in the world ever responded until one day, but it wasn't a man. Not only was she not a mortal, but it was a goddess and not a priest. On Mount Olympus, beauty was more than just love. She was demanding retribution. Aphrodite was the goddess of vanity, power, and no one used it like her. Longing for exquisite attractiveness and seduction, yet recently, her temples reverberated with her monument, stood lonesomely in the sunlight. Why? Because mortals today pretended to be the new goddess of love while kneeling in front of Psyche, a human girl. This was not only disrespectful Aphrodite, it was treachery. The goddess observed from her lofty. She had destroyed monarchs for less, and now her jealousy was turning into fury. What did Aphrodite do when a mortal girl stole from her worshippers? She was a live insult to divine beauty. She called forth her son, Eros, who was not just any deity as goddesses do. Yes, the god of love, but mortals did not write poems about the gentle, sweet love. Eros created rulers, caused turmoil, and ignited passion where none should be. His arrows didn't fall for con artists, queens for slaves, and enemies for one another. Request permission. They destroyed allegiance, reason, and occasionally entire civilizations. Making Psyche fall in love with the most beautiful thing was Aphrodite's simple instruction. Something horrific, something underneath even the most repulsive object on earth, worms, allowed her to experience the mockery of love. Ever the dutiful son, Eros lifted bow onto his back, quiver full of using divine arrows. He entered the mortal world when it was still dark. Discovered Psyche, sleeping in her chamber, her features flickering like water in the candlelight. She was stunning. Eros, who had pierced 1,000 hearts, felt his own heart skip a beat because it was too lovely. Beat. This wasn't right. This wasn't the plan. Yet he still grabbed his arrow. But while he was preoccupied, something went wrong and the arrow slid out of his grasp. Just a drop of blood pricked his skin, but it was sufficient. The god of love had just fallen prey to his own strength, and destiny changed at that precise instant, because Eros would be Psyche's silent guardian instead of his mother's weapon. But they were both unaware of the cost the gods would impose for this forbidden love, and Aphrodite would not. Before Psyche could awaken from her slumber, Os disappeared, leaving behind the scar from his own betrayal. He had pierced innumerable hearts with an arrow that was still warm against his flesh, but never once. Had he succumbed to his own deception? Now, with each heartbeat, he experienced he was so infatuated that he failed to see the necessity of protecting, cherishing, and concealing her. From Olympus's ruthless gaze, yet sacrifice was necessary for protection. Couldn't be honest with her in case Aphrodite found out that he had defied her more severely. Because since he had fallen in love, neither Psyche nor he would receive any mercy. Thus, Eros silently promised to love her from the shadows. In the meantime, Psyche's without suitors, life became stranger every day. Her beauty, which was previously a show, has since changed, appeared to be cursed, and rumors of divine retribution circulated throughout the realm. Desperate and terrified, her father turned to the Apollo oracle and the she will marry instead of a mortal guy. According to the harsh remarks that were returned, even the gods fear this creature. So send her to the mountaintop clothed in her sister's gasped. Her family mourned, and as a bride, her fate awaited her. As though she had been carved into stone by the wind, Psyche remained motionless and silent. This creature was her fate, not love, not decision, but sacrifice. But she still consented not out of bravery, but out of resignation. She had been worshipped as a goddess, but had never experienced love. Maybe this is why she is so harsh. Aos's terrible destiny was just equilibrium, which he observed from above. Guilt-ridden, he had intended to keep her safe, but the gods had woven a web that he couldn't unravel. If he overtly intervened, his mother would be aware, but Psyche would be lost, so he came up with a scheme to take her to a hidden kingdom. Concealed in delusion and quiet, only he knew. He would love her not as a shadow. However, God would never reveal his face, never utter his name, and above, he would never be honest with her, because if she found out who he was, she was genuinely worried that everything might break, including the god of love. Heartache Psyche was whisked away from the mountain peak by a gentle yet powerful wind. She had anticipated cold rock, and gnashing her teeth. She was expecting a monster's roar, but there was none. Calm, dreamlike quietness. When she opened her eyes, she was different. She remained on the mountain longer, standing in a field of bright flowers. She had never seen a garden like this one. A polished stone path meandered through the field that leads to an impossibly large palace that is beyond our comprehension. Could construct their hallways whispered. Their pillars glistened like moonlight on sea. Psyche, her name without sound, entered the room expecting to be frightened. Yet she found serenity when unseen servants led her, cleaned her feet, and put robes on her shoulders. Although no one was setting the table, the food looked warm and aromatic. A deep, gentle, and compassionate voice spoke from the shadows at night. "This is your house, so don't worry." It was her invisible husband. However, there was no snarling beast or terrible creature that the oracle had promised. Form only a voice, and oddly, she wasn't scared by it. He never disclosed. Not even in the dark, he joined her every night in the peaceful velvet of the bedchamber. He whispered laughs in her ear and touched her face as if in a dream. She was falling in love quickly, and every morning he left before the sun rose. Without intimacy, without form, and without sight. Every word he said left her wanting more, but she requested once, "Never try to see me," which was the one thing he constantly pleaded. The voice grew strained as it said, "Why? If you see me, I must leave you forever." She did as she was told, but the enigma became more complex every day. How could such a good-hearted, considerate guy as the monster that the oracle forewarned of, which is why love must conceal its face, and why did he never whisper his Psyche when she spoke her name? It didn't matter to her that she didn't need to know, but the human heart is an interesting place, and doubts can grow, never remain buried for too long after planting, especially when family members are visiting, and particularly when sisters arrive with poison masquerading as affection. Weeks or months had passed. Strangely, Psyche experienced opulence, love, joy, and tranquility in the phantom castle. She was also aware of loneliness, just a voice in the dark, with no faces, names, or facts, and shadows kissing her lips. Then her husband's voice one morning was, "If you see them, different sorrow will follow," he continued. "See who your sisters believe." Psyche's heart broke because she missed them, yet they brought devastation instead of love. For the girl she used to date, their taunting, their tenderness, and even their envy served as her final link to the mortal world. She begged, "Let me see," before gods, palaces, and mysterious men. Eos hesitated at first, but he couldn't refuse her, so he agreed with them. One caution: don't let their remarks to taint what we already have. They'll attempt to. You must not listen, and the winds that once elevated Psyche will undo your trust. Brought her sisters to the unseen palace's garden gates, where they were astounded to see her because she seemed more alive. Wrapped in silks more exquisite than any queen's, her skin shining like under the starlight, they gave her a cautious embrace while concealing their jealousy behind fragile smiles. "Where is your spouse?" Psyche grinned and replied, "He only comes at night." The sisters froze. "You haven't seen him?" "I haven't seen him." She gave a nod, refuses to reveal his face. The other person gasped. What if he's a monstrous beast, or even worse would be, if he were one of the gods taking advantage of you and giggling behind your back while their voices were filled with tender concern? However, Psyche sensed that the old sibling rivalry had returned. Their comments were tempered by jealousy, which turned them into something darker. He maintains, "Is that love or incarceration that you have concealed a blind dependent?" The doubt was sown, and they watched it grow, grinning as they, "Just take a lamp one night and see for yourself if he loves you," they whispered as they went, kissing her cheeks. Can truth cause harm? Psyche observed them vanish into the wind, and for the she was trembling for the first time since coming to paradise, but not because of terror. Psyche couldn't sleep that night due to curiosity, so she laid wrapped in silk sheets in the dark, his arms coiled softly about her as he breathed. Stable at her side, but her thoughts were louder than his, louder than love. What if he's a monster? Her sister's words kept coming back to her like a spell. What if he's not who you believe him to be? He's taking advantage of you. She had blindly believed and fully committed to a voice in the dark, but did she fall from the bed out of love or just surrender? As the snow fell, she was still. Her bare feet brushed the chilly floor, and she held the wick of a tiny bronze oil lamp was already burning, and her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned closer, her fingers shaking, and when the light reached, She gasped at his face. Not a monster, nor a god in disguise, a man who was breathtakingly lovely phrases. Soft lips curving in sleep, golden curls knotted on the pillow, and on his OS, the god of love had feathery wings on the rear and folded them like a secret. He had picked her, and her eyes were watering, not out of terror, but out of remorse. Had doubted, leaned closer, and trusted her, warned her, and loved her, intending to give him a quick kiss and apologize in a whisper before the light went out. But a single drop of scorching oil fell from the lamp and hit his face, proving that fate is harsh. He awoke with a yell of agony and treachery, his wings flapping open on his bare shoulder. "You broke your commitment," he murmured in a hollow voice, his eyes wide with sorrow. "You believed fear over love." "I'm sorry," Psyche said as she fell to her. Eros stepped back, his brilliance fading. Knees. "I only needed to know. Now you do." The palace collapsed behind him as he disappeared into the night. Psyche was abandoned on a desolate surface as the invisible world they had shared disintegrated like smoke. Slope. Her heart broken, the lamp still glowing in her grasp. She had witnessed the Psyche roamed barefoot and lost him to uncertainty rather than fate. Shattered across an abruptly colder planet. The verdant meadows, the voice that used to soothe her to sleep, was no longer heard in the silky halls, and the sky provided no. The ground offered no consolation, only her remorse persisted. Every stride felt heavy. She cried out to Oz in fields, forests, rivers, and even in thoughts, but no response was received. The god of love had disappeared, not from Olympus, but Psyche fled her life and went back to her father's house in desperation. But the palace that had once loved her was now rife with gossip about her sisters. Triumphant in her suffering, she said she had lost everything after marrying a devil. She fled again after someone accepted her story of love, gods, and flying husbands. This time, instead of being exiled, she was determined to find OS, no matter how far she had to leave, even if it meant going to Olympus, regardless of the fury she could encounter itself. But since mortals can't just stroll into the sky, she looked for the only someone who might lead her, the one who initiated it all, Aphrodite. Indeed, the goddess had good reason to despise Psyche, but if Eros, still Psyche, would brave Olympus's wrath to gain forgiveness, if there was even the slightest chance that she might be loved. She discovered Aphrodite in a secluded garden with mirrors surrounding it, rather than in a golden temple. The goddess appeared as though looking for floors that weren't there, into her own reflection, when Psyche. "I warned you once," the goddess muttered, but Aphrodite didn't turn as she approached. "I adore him, Aphrodite. You touched what was mine." Psyche knelt, chilly and quiet, said, "You love him," referring to the son you betrayed and the god you questioned. Psyche acknowledged his foolishness, but I will stop at nothing to regain his faith. Aphrodite's eyes become as keen as razors. Psyche nodded, and the goddess grinned, but it wasn't a nice one, so you'll suffer. We'll be put to the test, and maybe you'll be worthy after your suffering is over. Of my son, which started a test of dedication and psyche rather than strength. Would have to deal with it alone. Aphrodite wasted no time in revealing her beauty. Legendary, but if Psyche desired even more, her ruthlessness when provoked was just as divine. A chance to visit Eros once more, she would need to demonstrate her value through a number of challenging tasks. The first one was, she was guided by the seemingly straightforward Aphrodite to a large storage room where mountains barley, millet, lentils, poppy wheat, beans, and other seeds were scattered all over the floor. combined to create an unidentifiable mess by evening, Aphrodite remarked, yawning. Assign each grain and seed to its appropriate pile. If you don't, you'll... She hummed to herself as she walked away, leaving Psyche to gaze at the impossible work. She knelt down and started to clean up the mess, even though it would take 1,000 hands to do it in a day. Her fingers were shaking as she picked seed after seed, and the minutes seemed to drag on forever. She wasn't quite halfway through, but the gods are constantly keeping an eye on her, as do their unseen by the ego. A line of ants, not just ordinary ants, had been observing her labor. Maybe they pied the girl because these were revered by the harvest deity Data. Maybe love moved them, and in a sudden rush of activity, hundreds of tiny, with startling accuracy, the ants created living rivers as their legs raced across the floor, separating the seeds. Within minutes, the order emerged from chaos, with barley on one side and lentils and millet on the other. Pyramids. It was similar to witnessing the laws of time being rewritten by nature itself, when Aphrodite returned at dusk, she encountered perfection rather than failure. "You had aid," she shouted, narrowing her eyes. Psyche bowed her head. Only Aphrodite's lips quirked with a mixture of rage and laughter as she did what she could. She hadn't anticipated the mortal girl to finish the assignment, much less gracefully. Yet nevertheless, there are still a lot of challenges left, including more difficult and deadly ones. This was merely the beginning, the goddess cautioned. You'll need more than luck if you wish to meet Eros again. But Psyche was worn out and sore. However, I stood nodding and said, I'll do whatever it takes. Because genuine love was more valuable than either earthly pride or divine comfort. With Psyche's war just getting started, she hardly had time to relax before Aphrodite gave her the second assignment, which was even more intricately designed. Do you see that river over there? The goddess inquired, gesturing towards a meandering stream that shimmered in the afternoon sunlight. Its fleece is composed of gold and it runs alongside a field where wild rams graze. Try not to die, but give me a handful of it. She smirked and disappeared. Psyche was left to deal with what she realized was more than a simple task. These golden rams were not kind animals. Their horns were as sharp as spears, their eyes were fierce, and they were known to bleed. They gleamed like treasure, yet were protective of anything that entered their field and tore intruders apart without warning. Despite her anger, Psyche down the hill and made her way to the field. Her heart was racing as she knelt beside the reeds and observed the animals moving about on their hooves. Their growls reverberated low and primordially as they smashed against stones. There was no way she went to her knees, tears welling up as terror clawed at her, convinced that she could survive approaching their area in the daytime resolution. But the world observed once more as a soft murmur filtered through the tall grass. It was a river spirit, a gentle sound like reeds waving in time. The spirit said, "The rams are furious. Do not enter the field while the sun is high." The old presence was tied to the stream during the day, but when dusk approaches, they take a nap in the shade. No beast will miss it if you collect the wool from the thorny branches where it has snagged. Hope returned, and Psyche waited for hours. As night fell, she slipped past the golden rams, who gradually went into the trees and fell asleep, proceeded cautiously and discovered golden fleece tufts entangled in brambles, and she collected the wool by moonlight and went back to Aphrodite, who narrowed her. The goddess whispered, "You live again," as she gazed at the glittering handful in Psyche's hand, inquisitive, but Psyche remained silent, showing no pride. boasting simply because she had learnt something from love. Even the gods had forgotten that courage persists, even when it becomes quiet. Additionally, Psyche was far from done fighting Aphrodite, even though she was still testing her. Psyche, irritated, having survived activities designed to destroy her with nothing but tenacity and a peculiar, unbreakable luck, the goddess's grin had vanished. Substituted by calculating coldly, therefore she conducted a third trial. Psyche on errand that ought to have put a definitive end to her adventure. "Fetch me water," she stated from the river itself, not from a well or a stream. Psyche palled. The Styx were not just any river. They were the line between the waters of the world of the living and the dead were holy, cursed, and lethal. To mortals didn't make it through its banks, and even the gods were afraid to touch it. Even though they never came back, Psyche nodded. Her path had taken her to the brink of a cliff so sheer that it appeared to have been chiseled by titans. Styx whirled like black glass far below the river, and vapor rose from it. Its river did not flow. Instead, it coiled like a curse and the wailing of lost souls. The river was still being guarded by grotesque creatures with wings. They roared and swooped at anything that moved, their claws sharp enough to rip bone from flesh. With no hope, no road forward, and no way down, she fell beneath a holding the crystal vial that Aphrodite had teasingly given her on the rock ledge. "Just enough to show you tried," the goddess had replied after a drink. But then a glimmer. Eh? A tiny creature, an eagle enormous by bird, rose from a crevice in the stone as a high-pitched hum filled the air. Zeus himself sent the golden-eyed royal imperial eagle of without saying anything. It removed the bottle from Psyche's grasp, extended its wings, and screaming but not daring to attack, the centuries soared down the terrible cliff. Because Zeus's order was respected even by death. The eagle returned in a matter of moments. She didn't inquire as she placed the sealed vial containing Styx's shimmering, cursed waters in Psyche's shaking hands. Why would Zeus assist her? Maybe Aos had previously assisted him. Maybe even gods respected the tenacity of love. When Psyche went back to Aphrodite, the goddess took the vial with stony Psyche had once again passed away in silence. But the last trial would lead her to even. Not all love stories make it through an underworld journey, and gods are afraid to go. Aphrodite continued, "For your last task, you will," in a voice colder than the Styx themselves, "travel to Hades, where you will plead with Queen Persephone for a box of her beauty, is a present you see for me. Lately, I've been feeling really worn out by your presence. Wears me out. Even the bravest mortals avoided the death penalty." Psyche did not enter the Hades realm and return, but the living did. Longer hesitated. Darkness would not exist if the route to OS was via it. Halt here. Led by empathetic voices that mutter phrases like Demeter, she discovered a cave with a secret entrance that was punctured by invisible demons of benevolence. Like a forgotten wound on the surface of the world, she brought 2 coins for Charon. Cerberus, the 3-headed hound, the ferryman, and barley cakes. Every step farther sucked the heat from her bones. Silence, not smoke, filled the air. Like memories, the souls she passed faded away, hollow and inaccessible. Charon took her money at the river and took her on a ride across quiet waters tainted with unremembered sorrow. Persephone served Cerberus the cakes when he snarled at the entrance of her palace, and he licked his lips quietly. Persephone sat calmly on her obsidian throne, her eyes like polished glass, her jaws smeared with blood. The queen answered politely, "You come for beauty. But at what price?" "Yes, I do. I must deliver it to Aphrodite because I don't desire it for myself, Psyche retorted. She nodded and said, perhaps she too understood the madness of love, gave Psyche a tiny, unmarked, unopened package that was extremely weighty. Do the queen admonished, do not open it. It is not intended for your eyes. Psyche thanked and turned to go. The trip back was peaceful, but more difficult now that she was tempted. The box throbbed in her palms. She repeatedly assured herself, surely just a peek couldn't hurt. But she had doubts, like earlier intruded. What if this beauty earned her OS once more? Was the last key? The surface was close by. Her fingers twitched, her heart raced, and she opened the box as the first light returned to her face in days. And the instant Psyche opened the box expecting illumination, blackness engulfed her, and beauty, like a breath from the dead, a chilling mist poured out of it. It wasn't beauty, it was sleep, not just any sleep, but the radiance of God. Pesfaneni created the underworld's deathless slumber to maintain her dominance, rather than to make Aphrodite look more beautiful. Psyche just dropped, her body falling gently, without screaming or collapsing. The sealed box next to her was placed on the grass at the boundary of the mortal world. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't alive either. Her limbs were frozen, and her breath was quiet. Her curiosity stopped her heart, causing her to pause indefinitely. And although that might have been the end of the Psyche, love has the ability to endure death. OS had his wounds had healed, but his heart had not. Therefore he had avoided her, plagued by visions of his mind struggling through unachievable tasks at his mother's instruction. And when he heard she had defied Aphrodite and entered the underworld, knowing that she had done it for him. It was a queen, not a mortal girl, who risked her life for love. Rising from Olympus in a flash of wings and gold, Os disobeyed his mother, sped across the sky, the clouds separating at his heels, till he discovered her lying quietly and unmoving As the dusk kissed the marble statue, he collapsed on his knees next to her and sobbed without. He lifted the box, tears of grief, but also anger, regret, and love too great for words. He leaned down and gave her a kiss without hesitation after softly closing it. Lips, a promise, a memory, a plea, and her lips, not a magical kiss, not a spell. Psyche's eyes opened, and she gasped as her hands groped for the sleep that was lifting like fog. Eros breathed for him before she could even speak. And you returned, he said. I never stopped loving you, he said, holding her closer than ever. At that point, every deity who had observed, some pleased, some enraged, finally realized that even the god of love had been surpassed. Olympus was rocked by their reunion since the god of love had disobeyed his mother. Together, they had transcended the barriers, and Psyche, a mortal, had resisted death. Between duty and desire, between divine and human, such love was risky. Enraged, Aphrodite rushed into the god's court and demanded punishment. She yelled that this mortal must be destroyed because she has denigrated the gods, tampered with holy rules, and perverted my son. The gods were no longer so sure after witnessing Psyche's suffering. Her love endured what no mortal love ever could: suffering, perseverance, and resurrection. The issue still needed to be resolved, so they looked to Zeus, the king on his throne. The gods sat in silence, lightning in one hand and fate in the other. He had witnessed everything, from the collapse of Psyche's to her ascent from uncertainty to dedication. Finally, he said, Zeus has power. Aphrodite opened her mouth to object, saying, in a love that endures. However, he held up a hand, saying, You tested her, and she passed more than any mortal I have ever seen. She is evidence that even mortals are worthy of Olympus." He then turned to OS and Psyche, saying, "You want to be together truly?" They both nodded forever, and then, whatever the case, Zeus called forth he offered Psyche the drink of the gods, a glass full of ambrosia, and you will no longer be mortal. Your soul and heart will beat eternally, will coexist with us, but your hardships won't be forgotten. You'll bear them as we. Psyche accepted the goblet, but her hands didn't hold the stories that mold us. She drank, trembling as warmth poured through her senses, not burning, but flowering. Enlarged. Like a bell tolling across the room, her heartbeat slowed and then deepened. Centuries, and she suddenly became heavenly, no longer mortal or inferior. OS took her hand, and they were proclaimed husband and wife in front of all of Olympus. For once, love had not ended in the instant Psyche sipped the ambrosia. The tragedy was crowned. Her body and spirit underwent a total metamorphosis, and her skin glistened. With heavenly brilliance, her eyes no longer filled with tears, but with galaxies. Once mocking her mortal blood, the gods now gazed in wonder. For the first time in the lengthy history of Olympus, a mortal had gained her position among them not via ancestry, but by devotion. She was now Psyche, not Psyche the beautiful, or Psyche the girl. The immortal, a deity unto herself, even though she had previously been cursed by Aphrodite, could no longer ignore what was in front of her. A woman who had experienced loneliness, betrayal, desire to die, and still, the goddess of love was slow to forgive, preferring love over pride. However, Psyche's husband aggressively pushed forward, despite the fact that Eros was his mother's son. He softly remarked, "She is something else. She is no match for your beauty, mother." Completely the soul that is aware of love, and the tension vanished at that same time. Aphrodite's quiet was her submission to Zeus, not entirely, but sufficiently. Declared her struggles to be those of the goddess of the soul, Psyche, whose name in Greek means both soul and breath of life, had molded her into the embodiment of what love endures, rather than a statue of perfection. Olympus hosted a magnificent feast, with nectar flowing like rivers, and stars dancing throughout rejoicing, and even the fates grinned at the tale they had previously spoken in whispers. Psyche no longer supported OS. Fearful or unsure, she was equal and divine. Together, they observed the earthly world below and the heavens above, guardians of the voyage of love and the spirit, and the birth of a girl named Hydone, from their union goddess of pleasure and enjoyment, a representation of happiness created when love and soul come together. Psyche danced in endless brightness where she had previously strolled among thorns and shadows, not because she was flawless, but she was evidence because she had loved, grieved, and risen again. That one hardship at a time, even mortals and the heartbroken could ascend to the sky. As a result, the story of OS and Psyche did not end tragically like many fatal love does, but it transforms into something far larger rather than a myth. Truth that has been spoken for generations in storytellers' halls, temples, and dreamers. True love is difficult. It is tried, questioned, and hurt. However, it becomes eternal when it persists. Psyche's journey started with beauty. She was cursed by strangers who were envious of her sisters, even though she never asked for it. Gods had tricked her, punishing her first for loving and again for loving back. But she never ceased trying, but she persisted even after her faith faltered and her heart broke. Eros, the god of love, taught him that love is not a weapon as he was strolling. It is light, certainly, but only when confronted. It is neither a game nor a secret hidden in the shadows. Together, they imparted a lesson to Olympus that it had long forgotten. Love is not just the domain of the gods. In Greek temples, lovers would pray not only to Aphrodite, but also to anyone who was prepared to fight for it. Before marriages, births, and even funerals, they would whisper her name, since she wasn't just a goddess who served as a reminder that hope can endure. That no matter how deep the love is, it may rise again after falling. Regardless of how severe the trial, the heart understands how to return to the underworld today. Even after empires and temples have gone, the myth endures in that the term psyche means soul, and psychology is the study of that soul. Every story in which love is put to the test and overcomes, and the psyche endures, is not as marble statues, but as echoes inside each of us whenever we decide to put our trust in God instead of our fear. We follow their path, choosing love over silence and forgiveness over pride. Maybe we become somewhat more divine like them. Before statues froze in mid-scream and serpents, she was feared. Medusa was a mortal girl who was incredibly lovely, whispered on marble floors. Compare how her beauty existed unannounced and wasn't overt or arrogant. Sunlight streaming through stone. Her hair glistened like silk threads in the middle of the night. Even though she was silent, her eyes captured the serenity of waters before storms. She was born into a family of monsters, which made both rulers and gods uneasy. During a period when monsters were both revered and feared, her sisters Uriel and Steno were created to be eternally ferocious and hideous. But Medusa was unique, since she was the only one who was mortal and could die, which might have made her especially more valuable. But Medusa desired no palace, no lovers, and no divine crown. Favor, she opted for a more uncommon kind of devotion. She joined the revered service of Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, combat, and temperance, when she was a young lady. In the resounding Medusa swept the floors and illuminated the marble temple perched on cliffs overlooking the sea. Long before dawn, burning incense and muttering prayers, she took the oath of silence, virginity, and purity, not because she had to, but because she thought she adored Athena as an ideal strong woman as much as a deity, unassailable above mortal heart's chaos. Over time, even the populace started to worshippers would steal looks at Medusa, whispering that she was a living statue of Athena herself. Her voice was rarely heard during her life, and her face became a symbol while she pretended to pray. Confined by sacred duty, but even in a temple, beauty is not safe, according to Medusa's beyond the walls of the temple, beyond the cities, through the forests, and into the realm of gods, and peril accompanied it, as desire frequently donned a celestial face, and it was quite difficult to distinguish between adoration and possession. One god in particular caught our attention, not a wise or restrained one, but a sea, storm, and hungry god, and although Medusa remained true to her promises, fate had already started to change, since even purity can be twisted in the world of gods. Punished, and Medusa's haven would soon turn into her jail. Deep beneath the Poseidon proudly dominated the oceans with his thundering waves and deep coral mansions. Rage and an unquenchable desire. He had tamed creatures that were born storms and deity claims, but his gaze now shifted to something much less. Medusa, a mortal and celestial being, was so beautiful that even. However, it was her composure, her self-control, and her unwavering grace that fascinated him. She had chosen a life that did not belong to any mortal ruler, god, or man, of devotion that separated her from desire, and maybe that's what enticed her. Poseidon observed her more, the more she prayed, and one night when the temple was deserted and the tide was high, could not be forgiven. Temples never forgot, and gods never expressed regret. Thus the penalty had to be symbolic. She stood over Medusa, everlasting, descending from the pedestal of her statue, who shuddered in confusion as she waited for the very deity she had spent years worshipping to show her pity. But she did not. Rather, Athena's voice reverberated between marble walls like thunder. "You have brought disgrace into my home. Let the world witness the devastation that can result from beauty." She touched Medusa's forehead with a single motion, instantly changing her into a golden being. Her skin lost its warmth as her hair changed into writhing serpents, and they hissed in a harsh imitation of muttered prayers. Her eyes, which had previously been kind with grief, now had a terrifying power. Not foes, not invaders, but everyone who looked into them would turn to stone. It was isolation, a curse masquerading as protection, rather than a punishment. Medusa screamed in defense, her voice no longer human, her tears turning to seawater. Her breath went silent as it dried before falling, and her reflection broke in mirrors, and worst of all, she was unable to see another person. Athena didn't cry or turn away without destroying it. She just seen how her priestess, who had once been lovely and pious, changed, completely a monster. Medusa locked the temple doors behind him as her cries reverberated through the hills as she fled into exile. There was no home, no temple, no sisters, no prayers, only stone paths from the Olympus cliffs, and in her wake unfazed, Athena went back to her seat. Since, in the sight of the gods, Medusa's look would endure beyond memory, and she would be banished from both the city and the temple. Medusa feared and cursed as she ventured into the jungle by herself. Her steps carved every chance look at a passing creature turns the stone trail over the countryside into dead marble. Deer in the undergrowth, birds in mid-flight, and even insects that dared to look into her eyes were frozen. She wanted safety where no man would pursue her in the distance, forever in solitude. Places that are uninhabited by gods or beyond rivers and ruin to a desolate, windswept island at the edge of the globe. There, mortals, she constructed no shelter. What was the purpose? A roof when the stars provided no solace, and what good were walls when her adversaries had served as her guardians? When she first reached the cave, it was already partially filled with statues of long-forgotten soldiers, animals, or possibly even fellow wanderers who looked into her eyes for too long, and thus her second existence started. As a pariah rather than a priestess, Medusa stopped crying. Her tears belonged to the girl she used to be, the one who gave incense and believed in justice to Athena, who believed that loyalty might win love. That girl had perished on the temple floor. Something else, not a monster, but a woman molded by treachery, took her place. Her serpents warned her in her dreams, not with words, but with instincts. Her eyes had turned into her guardians, and she cursed her soul over the sounds of invaders and approaching footsteps. Flashing memories. She started drawing faces on the cave walls. Even her sister's memories of her were dwindling, as were the temple she had formerly served. All she had left was stone. Sometimes heroes would arrive, enticed by tales of attempted by the prospect of murdering a beast or a cursed lady. They thought she was bad, and that by killing they undervalued her. Therefore, even if they might ascend to fame, none of them came back. Not only her might, but also her suffering. But Medusa felt less like a victim, more akin to the global monster that her humanity had not dead, but it was withering, and the gods had already turned their backs on it. In Greece's busy city-states and revered temples, Medusa's name started to shift and was no longer used in lamenting it as it spread from person to person, like a misreported alarm, and Medusa, the Gorgon Medusa, the cursed, was transformed. Medusa, a seductress whose eyes make men stone, was once a devout priestess. Under myth, a mortal maiden who served the gods was buried. In its stead, they didn't mention the monster's narrative about the serpent-haired creature, whose eyes glowed with the anger of the abyss. They neglected to convey Athena's harsh punishment for Poseidon's transgression. The roles of the gods were smoothed over and removed by priests and poets who wanted their gods to be immaculate and their monsters to be obvious. Soldiers etched Medusa's picture onto children, warning them to obey their parents, or she would appear at night. Shields to make fun of her, rather than to honor her. Her face became a representation of fear. Warning story, but her image persisted, and artists depicted her on ceramics. Her growling visage was carved into a temple, and her twisted silhouette swirled across mosaics, walls as a weapon employed by the same gods who had cast her, not out of respect. Without asking, Medusa in exile could only feel the weight of their remarks. To become a legend, she just endured. She didn't ask to be feared. On the mainland, some people murmured about her as a threat to the survival of those in authority. Old women in mountain villages placed offerings close to caverns, whispering that they were more than a monster. Women who had been harmed were protected by Medusa. They pied her instead of being afraid of her, referred to her as the guardian of the wronged, but they were quiet voices, and the thunder of hero stories overshadowed them, and Medusa stayed concealed, oblivious to how profoundly. What she did know was that her name had divided some people into monsters and others into martyrs. Regardless of how far she hid, men with swords would continue to approach. Men in sparkling armor who had never given a damn and who believed that killing her would bring them fame. She was merely what she had been, and somewhere there was already a new competitor birth of a boy who would become a man, a hero, and her last guest. A kid named Perseus was born to a different kind of family, while Medusa was living in exile, and her tale spread like wildfire. Silence, a prophecy prison. His mother Danae had been imprisoned. Desperate to halt a prophecy that her son will eventually cause his death, she was placed in a bronze tower by her father, King Acreus. However, the gods don't value mortal hair. Therefore, Zeus arrived in Danae not out of love, but as, during that miraculous encounter, golden rain slipped past barriers and cautions. When Perseus was born, the monarch casted the mother because he dared not immediately slay a son of Zeus. A silent execution wrapped a baby in a wooden casket and sealed them into the water. In cowardice, but Poseidon's waves swept them away without killing them. A fisherman escorted them to safety after they washed up on the island of Serapos. Perseus was reared in concealment by them in Deir, who taught him humility, strength, and the she never spoke Zeus's name or the type of god that had produced him amid the stillness of survival. Over the years, Perseus developed into a sharp-eyed, intelligent, and powerful young man, yet untested. Then Polydectes, the king of Serapos, arrived. Perseus blocked the king's path because he wanted Dire for himself. A feast was hosted by kindness, and each visitor was expected to bring a present for Perseus, who was impoverished. Polydectes scoffed and proudly delivered nothing, then brought me Medusa's head. It was intended to embarrass him, but Perseus was wounded by pride and didn't realize it. The gods observed Athena with curiosity as the truth behind the name was accepted. Maybe still feeling bad about what she had done to Medusa, she spotted a chance. She will help this youngster for balance rather than justice. She and Hermes arrived at Perseus, received tools, winged sandals, and whispered instructions in his dreams. Fly an adamantine sword, the helm of Hades, and a mirror-like polished shield. To disappear, yet no gift was given in vain. Perseus had been selected, not only to defeat a monster, but also to finish a myth that started not with him, but with a lone girl in a temple, pleading with unheeding gods. With the burden of a king's task on his shoulders and divine equipment by his side, Perseus started off, but discovering Medusa's journey was more complicated than just traveling by land or sea. She had been buried, hidden over time, even from the gods who had afflicted her. In order to locate Perseus, he looked for the Gray Three ancient people because he needed answers that no mortal could provide. Sisters who were older than shadow-draped gods and had only one eye and one teeth between them. Despite existing in the space between nightmare and light, they were aware of Medusa's location. Sleep because they were her relatives. Perseus didn't ask for help or make a plea. Waited until one of the sisters grabbed the eye out of their hands after passing it to another. "Tell me," he insisted, threatening to keep them blind or hold their soul sight captive. They hissed indefinitely, but they also spoke, telling him about a far-off island that was not visible on mortal maps. Past crags where stone statues littered the shoreline and ships were torn to pieces. Like fallen soldiers, an island where no stars dared to dwell, and no birds sang Medusa's lair, while Perseus flew in sandals, cutting through the clouds with his heart. His heart was racing with anticipation rather than fear as he imagined himself going back to Serapos with a head in his hands, a victorious, proud, and humbled Polyctus. He had not yet challenged the narrative that Medusa was a monster who deserved it. The gods had prepared him for death, but they had neither forewarned him or stated that the corpses of men who referred to themselves as heroes lined her cave. They had not claimed that her eyes were not. They hadn't said that her face was beneath the serpents and cruel only cursed. Behind the myth, the figure of a once faithful wife was still present. The winds howled louder as he soared across the water, perhaps attempting to communicate, but the only sound Perseus heard was silence, which the gods were aware of because when you make the last thing you want, monster, is for someone to hear her voice. The universe appeared to hold its breath as Perseus landed on the island. There was no breeze and no bird music. Hundreds of statues were strewn across the cliffs and crags like fallen warriors, their features contorted in fear. When they last saw her, their eyes were wide and their mouths were stopped in mid-scream. As Athena had warned him, he stepped across broken shields and stone limbs while keeping his sword sheathed and his mirrored shield tightly in place. Never look at her directly. Use reflection. Be swift. Be silent. But what? The reason the sculptures appeared not just frightened, but also shocked, as though in their last moments, was something the goddess had not said. Perseus proceeded farther into the subterranean wings after they realized they were mistaken. The wet moss, snake smell, and something else filled the air as he folded behind him. Otherwise, he felt sorrow as the serpents hissed before he saw her, a low, warning symphony. And then she seemed exhausted, not charging, not shouting, not even realizing Medusa was sleeping. Coiled like a child on a bed of stone, her arms wrapped around her, her face in the reflected shield was serene and delicate, with an odd beauty that persisted within her. Features were partially obscured by the tangle of poisonous snakes that were currently sleeping. She appeared to be someone who had been abandoned rather than a monster. Perseus paused, realizing that this was not the terrifying beast depicted in mythology. She was merely a woman sleeping, cursed, and completely alone atop urns and shields. However, he had been assigned a mission by the gods. He recalled his mother. He recalled the Polyctus's taunting words brought back memories of glory, so he raised his sword. He stepped closer, his gaze riveted on the mirrored shield, and a snake raised its Medusa's head jerked, her eyes fluttering but remaining shut. But she didn't scream, not struggle. She was hardly breathing when Perseus struck the blade, hissed with a holy edge through the air, and when her head fell, silence ensued. The island exhaled into the bag lined with bronze scales, believing that the curse had been lifted. Because a body can be killed, but a story cannot, and Medusa's tale was simply, with Medusa's head buried in the charmed satchel, Perseus didn't linger at first. He climbed into the heavens, sandals pounding against the sky, still powerful even in death. Clouds, but the island's silence held him close, not a triumphant silence. While being severed, the head continued to pulsate with a calm power while being cooler. Not dead, the snake's writhing tongues flickered as they sensed what was outside the bag. Unblinking, eyes that might frighten anyone who dared stare in the gods had given Perseus a weapon, a divine one, but he dared not look within. Trump card. But as he traveled over the ocean, he started to feel uncomfortable carrying it. Shadow creatures swirled in the seas because, despite being heroic in the mortal world, this deed had rekindled Medusa's ancient pacts. Death had not gone ignored. Her murderer had disturbed the deep water. Poseidon saw the balance, Athena was aware of it, and the fates were silent and far above. A storm started to build up on Olympus, but Perseus persisted. His thoughts were, he was so focused on the future that he would go back to Serapos and silence King. He would be a hero if Polyctus freed his mother and restored his identity. That's what the stories promised, but the satchel's weight revealed another story. He recalled the mirror, shield and the face that he had seen, where she hadn't snarled or lunged. Sleeping. Did he kill a warning wrapped in a body, or was that a real monster? Initially, he dismissed the idea. The gods had led him, hadn't they? But as the wind, Perseus heard a louder cry and saw something strange. The skull was humming, but a feeling as though the universe was still remembered, as though Medusa's soul cursed, deceived, disfigured, but still conscious, still waiting. And even while Perseus would go on to save maidens, defeat monsters, and leave his mark on the stars, he would never sleep peacefully since he occasionally claimed to hear the faint rattling of snakes under his bedroll. And occasionally he had dreams of defeat rather than of a young woman pleading with the gods to keep her safe while praying in a temple. Perseus came back. The populace welcomed Serapos, who had windswept, hair, divine armor, and a legendary head hidden behind his cloak. Cheering, not knowing what was inside the satchel or how much it had cost. But being a shrewd ruler, King Polyctus never thought the boy would live. Perseus entered the palace with his head held high because the challenge had been a mocking death sentence. The king's sneer soon changed to uneasiness. "You brought me a present," and Polyctus made fun of it. Attempting to maintain control, Perseus nodded after receiving a token of your request. He then opened the satchel, and for a moment, Polyctus looked into the eyes of stone shattered through Medusa's skin like ice in a single instant. His eyes went wide, and his last breath was caught beneath closed lips. Granite, the egotistical and harsh king, was reduced to a statue in the room, erupted in cries, and while some of the couriers went to their knees, Perseus stayed. His mother Dia hurried to finally embrace him as he fell silent, his face unreadable. To them, Medusa was a free girl, but Perseus mentioned nothing about her in the cave. Nobody inquired about her identity after the monster vanquished a tool and overcame an obstacle. However, Perseus recalled how her corpse had fallen and how her face had appeared in the mirror. The story spread swiftly, despite the pleas rather than the snarling. Songs were performed in temples. Be a child, Perseus was referred to be the Gorgon slayer, the gods' champion, and the breaker of curses. In his later years, they carved his name into marble without ever placing hers next to it. Athena had ordered him to place Medusa's head on her shield years earlier. Once derided, her face was now used as a tool of divine justice. But even in death, Medusa served, but not justice for her, justice for others. Perseus, the golden hero, strolled beneath her as her strength remained silent, her shield for years to come. He was adored and feared by the lady he had killed, and every win he won featured her face. Furthermore, neither could alter the roles that the gods had assigned them. Following Perseus's victory, Athena called him to Olympus, not just to honor him, but also to assert her right to what had always been hers. She wanted the head, not the helm of Hades, the sandals, or the sword. Perseus, the head of Medusa, complied by offering the bag without hesitation, and after practicing using her grace, Athena attached the severed head of her former priestess to her shield, her aegis, transforming it into something legendary weapon. The Gorgon's visage, which was once bright and innocent, is now snarled in wherever Athena marched. The goddess's arm's bronze curve held a frozen anger. Enemies turned to stone when they saw the war that followed. Cities collapsed. Aegis statues proliferated throughout temples, and her shield was minted. Became a banner and a warning, but nobody ever questioned why Medusa had Athena, the goddess of wisdom, carried the face after it was originally cursed. Of a lady she had previously disciplined, not as a reminder or out of remorse, but as an emblem of divine might and what occurs when humans go too far. Although some people muttered in contrast, some claimed that Athena was giving Medusa a weapon rather than taking it back. Immortality. She made sure Medusa would never be forgotten by putting her on the aegis, that the young woman who had wept in her temple was now immortalized where even the gods had to bear the repercussions of their deeds. But the truth, as always, paradoxically, Medusa was reprimanded by Athena for defaming her temple, and her metamorphosis was complete. She now carried the same humiliation like a prize. Prior to becoming a weapon, Medusa was a priestess, a victim, a monster, an icon, but somewhere in the terrible tilt of that chiseled jaw's curve, in her terrified eyes, there was something alive that the world couldn't ignore. Because there were always a select few, even when she reduced armies to stone, who saw an inquiry and a protest instead of a monster in her face, a warning, and no blade could match the strength of Medusa's now staring face, extending from Athena's aegis in an unwavering, immortal manner. To most, it represented with a single look the divine fear of adversaries was transformed into the stone of victories. But to some who peered more closely, that glare contained more than just rage, remembrance. It contained truth. It contained injustice. No temple scroll ever had the audacity to write as soldiers marched behind that shield for decades, not knowing that the visage they used to carry was once that of a woman who had never used violence. Her curse was given by her trauma had been fully weaponized, and the gods had turned into an instrument of dominion. Even after her voice was cut off, her eyes remained open. She saw rulers come and die, and her eyes witnessed 1,000 conflicts. She witnessed the destruction of temples, the cruelty of heroes, and the raising of altars to individuals who had referred to her as a monster, and those who were sympathetic to her loss mumbled prayers. Additionally, those women occasionally left offerings, such as tiny clay snakes, hidden shrines, a cloth-wrapped hair, a name murmured in the shadows, not out of fear, but in remembering, as Medusa was a warning story. Although she had been a guardian, her cave had turned into a cemetery for potential conquerors, sanctuary, a place where no man could live, where the hunted became untouchable. Over time, her mythology shifted, yet for some, she continued to be the Gorgon. For others, she transformed into a very different kind of symbol of resistance, goddess of anger and injured justice, a figure who protected the weak from predators. As myths often do, her story was twisted and warped, yet at its foundation, a woman harmed, a woman whose story had been taken, yet whose gaze had been transformed by suffering could never be removed, so she continued to look at sculptures and paintings, shields, money, and dreams, and each time it was recounted, a new person would halt. Was she the monster really? Someone would inquire. Additionally, Medusa asked that question. Centuries went on, empires fell, and new gods arose and vanished, but Medusa lived as a symbol and a shadow, not as flesh and blood. Cast in bronze and chiseled onto marble, they traveled across civilizations in Byzantium, and Rome's image persisted just beneath the surface of myth and memory in remote parts of the world. However, an odd development occurred over time. The story started to divide in one form. She continued to be the Gorgon, the snake-haired murderer who made men fear her. Her head turned into a talisman against evil, on a stone that glared at her. Soldiers took her into battle with armor, doors, and gates in the hopes that her legend would strike terror more deeply than any spear. Yet a different tale subtly developed in tandem with it. Medusa was not a character in this tale, which was murmured by poets, philosophers, and ladies whose voices hardly ever made it onto scrolls. Beast to be killed, but a wronged woman cursed for a crime and punished for her beauty perpetrated against her. It was whispered rather than roared. Questioned why the god of the sea would escape unpunished, and why a goddess of knowledge would punish her own servant. When she only wanted to be left alone in taverns, libraries, and secret places, many guys tried to kill her. Of temples, these inquiries grew like weeds in marble crevices, and gradually the Medusa's visage started to change once more. She turned into a mirror of fear instead of truth. Women started to identify with her as survivors of abuse, victims of silent souls compelled to adopt the moniker of monsters merely for fearing her. Her eyes were no longer a curse, but a blessing, and serpents were no longer a punishment. Betrayal sharpens defense. Even today, Medusa rises in contemporary stories and artwork. Once more, not to frighten but to testify, she looks sorrowfully at artworks, and her tale is recounted, not to exalt Perseus, but rather to inquire as to why he was referred to as a hero at all, as mythologies change and the monster isn't always the one with teeth, but the one brandishing the blade, and in each generation that has the courage to Medusa sees them and blinks once, challenging the traditional tale, start to comprehend